The Brave Adventures of Rosie, a Tale of Magic and Courage. Chapter 1: Rosie's Discovery. Rosie was a curious and adventurous child who loved to explore the world around her. She lived in a small village surrounded by forests, hills, and rivers. Rosie loved to wander through the woods, listening to the birds singing and feeling the breeze on her face. She was always on the lookout for something new to discover. One day, while playing in the woods, Rosie stumbled upon a hidden path. The path was narrow and covered in leaves, and it looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. Curious, Rosie decided to follow the path to see where it led. The path wound its way through the forest, and Rosie soon found herself in a part of the woods she had never seen before. The trees were taller and thicker, and the air felt charged with magic. As she walked deeper into the woods, Rosie noticed a faint glow in the distance. Intrigued, she quickened her pace and soon came upon a beautiful garden. The garden was filled with tall flowers of every color, and the air was sweet with their fragrance. The trees in the garden sparkled with shimmering lights, and in the center of the garden was a beautiful fountain surrounded by a pond filled with glowing fish. Rosie was amazed by the beauty of the garden and felt a sense of wonder she had never felt before. She explored the garden for hours, admiring the flowers, playing with the fish, and feeling the cool water from the fountain on her face. As the sun began to set, Rosie knew it was time to return home. She felt sad to leave the garden but promised herself that she would come back the next day to explore more. And so, Rosie returned home, feeling both exhilarated and content, eager to share her discovery with her family and friends. Chapter 2: The Mysterious Garden. The next day, Rosie eagerly returned to the garden. As she stepped into the garden, she saw that it was even more beautiful than she had remembered. The flowers were taller, the trees sparkled brighter, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers. Rosie wandered through the garden, admiring the flowers and feeling the cool breeze on her face. As she approached the fountain, she noticed a small, glittering object lying on the ground near the edge of the pond. Curious, she picked up the object and examined it closely. It was a small, silver key, intricately designed with delicate engravings. Rosie wondered what the key was for and looked around for a lock it might fit. She noticed a small door hidden behind the vines on the other side of the garden and wondered if the key might open it. Excited by the possibility, Rosie made her way to the door, her heart racing with anticipation. As she inserted the key into the lock, she heard a soft click, and the door slowly creaked open. Inside the door was a small room, illuminated by soft candlelight. The walls were covered in vines and flowers, and in the center of the room was a small table with a book on top. Rosie approached the table and examined the book. It was an old, leather-bound book with a title written in gold letters, The Secret of the Garden. Intrigued, Rosie opened the book and began to read. As she read, Rosie learned that the garden was a magical place, home to a group of fairies who guarded the garden and kept it hidden from the world. The book also explained that the fairies were very protective of the garden and did not allow humans to enter without their permission. Feeling both thrilled and a little scared, Rosie wondered if she would ever meet the fairies who lived in the garden. And if she did, What kind of adventures lay in store for her? Chapter 3: Dancing with Fairies. Rosie spent the next few days visiting the garden, each time bringing with her a new gift for the fairies. She left small offerings of sweets, flowers, and crystals, hoping that they would be pleased with her offerings and grant her permission to enter the garden again. One evening, as Rosie was wandering through the garden, she heard a faint rustling in the bushes. She looked around and saw a small group of fairies emerge from the undergrowth, their wings shimmering in the moonlight. Rosie watched in amazement as the fairies began to dance around her, their tiny feet barely touching the ground. Their laughter was like music, and Rosie felt her heart swell with joy. As the night wore on, Rosie danced with the fairies, feeling more alive than she had ever felt before. The fairies showed her how to move in ways she had never imagined, and Rosie was grateful for the opportunity to learn from them. As the night came to a close, the fairies began to flutter their wings and make their way back to their hiding places. Rosie watched them go, feeling a pang of sadness as they disappeared from sight. But as she turned to leave the garden, she saw a small, golden light hovering in the distance. Curious, she followed the light, and soon found herself standing in front of a small, intricately decorated tree. The golden light was emanating from the tree, and as Rosie approached it, she saw that it was covered in sparkling gems and jewels. The tree seemed to pulse with energy, and Rosie felt a sense of reverence wash over her. As she stood there, lost in thought, she suddenly heard a soft, musical voice behind her. "Greetings, young human," the voice said. "I am the Fairy Queen, and I have been watching you in the garden. I have seen your kind heart and your love for the beauty of nature. You are welcome in our garden, but you must always remember that this is a sacred place, and you must treat it with the utmost respect." Rosie felt a shiver run down her spine as she turned to face the voice. She saw a beautiful fairy, with wings the color of the sunset and eyes as bright as stars. The fairy was wearing a shimmering crown on her head, and Rosie realized that this must be the Fairy Queen. "I understand, Your Highness," Rosie said, bowing her head in respect. "Good," the Fairy Queen said. "I have a request for you, young human. Will you help us with a task that is beyond our abilities?" Rosie felt her heart race with excitement. She couldn't believe that the Fairy Queen was asking her for help. "What kind of task?" she asked, her voice filled with eagerness. "It is a task that involves the protection of our garden," the Fairy Queen said. "But before I tell you more, you must promise me that you will keep this a secret, and that you will do everything in your power to help us." Rosie nodded her head, feeling both honored and humbled by the Fairy Queen's trust in her. "I promise," she said. "I will do everything in my power to help you and to protect this garden." The Fairy Queen smiled, and Rosie felt a sense of warmth spread through her body. "Good," the Fairy Queen said. "Then let me tell you more about our quest." Chapter 4: The Quest to Protect the Garden. The Fairy Queen led Rosie to a small, secluded area of the garden where a group of fairies were gathered around a large, glowing crystal. The crystal seemed to pulse with energy, and Rosie could feel the hum of its power vibrating through her body. "This is the heart crystal," the Fairy Queen said. It is the source of the magic that keeps our garden safe and protected. But recently, we have sensed a disturbance in the magic. We fear that there may be an outside force trying to steal our magic and use it for their own purposes. Rosie listened intently, feeling a sense of urgency in the Fairy Queen's words. "We need your help, young human," the Fairy Queen continued. "We need you to go beyond the borders of our garden and search for any signs of danger or threat. We need you to find out who or what is trying to steal our magic, and put a stop to it before it's too late." Rosie felt a surge of determination rise within her. She knew that this was a big responsibility, but she also knew that she couldn't let the fairies down. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm and resolute. The Fairy Queen smiled, her eyes shining with approval. "Thank you, young human," she said. "We will provide you with everything you need for your journey. You will have our protection, and our magic will guide you on your quest." With that, the Fairy Queen led Rosie to a small clearing, where a group of fairies were waiting with a basket of supplies. They handed her a map of the surrounding area, a bag of enchanted crystals, and a small, glowing lantern that would guide her on her journey. "Remember, young human," the Fairy Queen said. "The fate of our garden rests in your hands. You must be careful, and you must be brave. But most of all, you must believe in the power of nature and the goodness of your heart." Rosie nodded, feeling a sense of determination and purpose that she had never felt before. With a deep breath, she stepped out of the garden and into the unknown, ready to embark on her quest to protect the magic of the fairy garden. As Rosie ventured beyond the borders of the fairy garden, she felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. The forest was dark and foreboding, and she could feel the presence of unseen creatures lurking in the shadows. But she reminded herself of the Fairy Queen's words and pressed on, determined to fulfill her quest. She followed the map that the fairies had given her, relying on the glowing lantern to light her way. As she walked, she collected enchanted crystals from the forest floor, adding them to her bag for protection. She felt a sense of comfort knowing that the fairies were watching over her, and she called upon their magic whenever she needed guidance. For days she journeyed through the forest, encountering all manner of strange and wondrous creatures. She met talking animals, mischievous imps, and even a friendly troll who offered to guide her through a treacherous mountain pass. With each new encounter, she grew more confident in her abilities and more determined to complete her mission. But as she approached the edge of the forest, she sensed a dark energy emanating from a nearby castle. The castle was surrounded by a moat filled with murky water, and a thick fog obscured the entrance. She knew that this was the source of the disturbance in the fairy garden's magic, and that she would have to face whatever dangers lay ahead. With a deep breath, Rosie stepped forward, determined to confront the unknown and protect the magic of the fairy garden. Chapter 5: The Journey Begins. As Rosie ventured beyond the borders of the fairy garden, she felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. The forest was dark and foreboding, and she could feel the presence of unseen creatures lurking in the shadows. But she reminded herself of the Fairy Queen's words and pressed on, determined to fulfill her quest. She followed the map that the fairies had given her, relying on the glowing lantern to light her way. As she walked, she collected enchanted crystals from the forest floor, adding them to her bag for protection. She felt a sense of comfort knowing that the fairies were watching over her, and she called upon their magic whenever she needed guidance. For days she journeyed through the forest, encountering all manner of strange and wondrous creatures. She met talking animals, mischievous imps, and even a friendly troll who offered to guide her through a treacherous mountain pass. With each new encounter, she grew more confident in her abilities and more determined to complete her mission. But as she approached the edge of the forest, she sensed a dark energy emanating from a nearby castle. The castle was surrounded by a moat filled with murky water, and a thick fog obscured the entrance. She knew that this was the source of the disturbance in the fairy garden's magic, and that she would have to face whatever dangers lay ahead. With a deep breath, Rosie stepped forward, determined to confront the unknown and protect the magic of the fairy garden. Chapter 6: Confronting the Darkness. Rosie approached the castle gate, which creaked open eerily as she drew near. The fog was so thick that she could barely see her own hand in front of her face, but she could feel the dark energy emanating from within. She cautiously stepped inside, her heart racing with fear and excitement. The castle was a maze of dark, twisting corridors, and she could hear the faint sound of whispering voices echoing through the halls. As she crept deeper into the castle, she noticed that the walls and floors were covered in vines and thorny plants. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and she could feel the presence of dark magic all around her. Suddenly, she heard a sound coming from one of the rooms ahead. She cautiously approached, her hand on the hilt of her sword, ready to defend herself if necessary. As she entered the room, she saw a figure hunched over a large, glowing crystal. The figure was cloaked in darkness, and she could not make out its features. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite her fear. The figure turned slowly, and she saw that it was a tall, menacing creature with glowing red eyes and a sinister grin. It was a dark fairy, and it was clear that it was the one responsible for stealing the magic of the fairy garden. "You're too late, little human," the dark fairy sneered. "The magic of the fairy garden is mine now, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." Rosie drew her sword, ready to fight. She knew that this was the moment she had been preparing for, and she was determined to protect the magic of the fairy garden at all costs. With a fierce battle cry, she charged at the dark fairy, the enchanted crystals in her bag glowing with a bright, protective light. The battle was fierce and intense, but Rosie's determination and the power of the enchanted crystals ultimately proved too much for the dark fairy. With a final burst of energy, she vanquished the evil creature and reclaimed the stolen magic of the fairy garden. Exhausted but triumphant, Rosie emerged from the castle, the sun shining brightly overhead. She knew that her journey was not yet over, but she felt a sense of accomplishment and pride in what she had accomplished so far. With renewed determination, she set out to return the magic to the fairy garden and continue on her quest. Chapter 7: Return to the Fairy Garden. With the stolen magic safely in her possession, Rosie made her way back through the forest, eager to return it to the fairy garden. The journey back was faster than the journey to the castle, As she now knew the path and the dangers that awaited her, as she approached the fairy garden, she could see the familiar glow of fairy dust and hear the sweet melodies of fairy music. The fairies had been anxiously awaiting her return, and they welcomed her back with open arms. Rosie presented the magic crystals to the fairy queen, who accepted them gratefully. She thanked Rosie for her bravery and for restoring the magic to the fairy garden, and she granted her a special gift in return. The fairy queen gave Rosie a small, enchanted pouch, which she said would provide her with protection and guidance on her journey. Inside the pouch was a map of the world, which showed the locations of all the magical creatures and hidden realms that Rosie had yet to explore. With renewed determination, Rosie set out once again on her quest. She traveled far and wide, encountering dragons, unicorns, mermaids, and other magical beings. She collected enchanted objects and learned new spells, honing her skills as a brave and powerful adventurer. But no matter where her travels took her, she always carried with her the lessons she had learned in the fairy garden. She remembered the importance of courage, kindness, and determination, and she knew that with these qualities, she could overcome any challenge. And so, Rosie's adventures continued, as she explored the wonders of the magical world and made new friends along the way. But she never forgot the fairy garden and the magical lessons it had taught her, and she knew that it would always be her home and the source of her strength. Chapter 8: Homecoming. After many months of traveling and adventure, Rosie began to feel homesick. She missed her family and the familiar comforts of her own home. She decided it was time to return to her village and share her stories with her loved ones. As she made her way back to her village, she could feel a sense of excitement and anticipation building within her. She wondered how her family and friends would react to her incredible adventures and the knowledge she had gained from her travels. Finally, she arrived back in her village, and she was met with a warm welcome from her family and friends. They were all amazed by her stories and the incredible things she had seen and experienced on her journey. Rosie felt a sense of pride and accomplishment as she shared her tales, but she also felt a sense of sadness as she realized that her journey was over. She knew that she could never return to the way things were before, that she had changed in ways that she could not yet fully understand. But as she looked around at the familiar faces of her loved ones, she realized that she didn't need to go on grand adventures to find happiness and fulfillment. She could find joy and wonder in the simple pleasures of everyday life, surrounded by the people she loved. And so, Rosie settled back into her village, grateful for the lessons she had learned and the memories she had made on her journey. She knew that there would always be more adventures waiting for her in the future, but for now, she was content to simply enjoy the beauty and magic of the world around her. Chapter 9: Passing on the Torch. As time passed, Rosie became known throughout the land as a fearless adventurer and a wise counselor. People from far and wide sought her out for advice and guidance, and she became a trusted leader in her community. But as she grew older, Rosie knew that it was time to pass on the torch to the next generation of adventurers. She wanted to inspire others to embark on their own journeys of discovery and to discover the magic and wonder of the world for themselves. She began to take on apprentices, young people who shared her passion for adventure and who were eager to learn from her. She taught them everything she knew about magic, courage, and kindness, and she encouraged them to be brave and to never give up on their dreams. As the years went by, Rosie watched with pride as her apprentices grew into powerful adventurers in their own right. They embarked on their own journeys, discovering new lands and encountering new challenges along the way. Rosie knew that she had done her part to pass on the legacy of courage and magic to the next generation. She knew that her teachings would live on through her apprentices and their own apprentices, and that the world would always be filled with brave and adventurous spirits. And though she was now an old woman, Rosie still felt the fire of adventure burning within her heart. She knew that she would always be a part of the magic and wonder of the world, and that her legacy would live on for generations to come. Chapter 10: The Legacy Lives On. As the years passed, Rosie became a legend, a beloved figure in the hearts and minds of people everywhere. Her name was synonymous with bravery, wisdom, and adventure, and her legacy continued to inspire new generations of adventurers. People would tell stories about Rosie around the campfire, passing down her tales of magic and courage to their children and grandchildren. And though the stories may have changed slightly over time, the message remained the same, that no matter how difficult the journey may seem, with courage and determination, anything is possible. Rosie eventually passed away, but her spirit lived on in the hearts and minds of those who had known her, and those who had only heard her stories. She had left behind a legacy of bravery and adventure, inspiring countless people to follow in her footsteps and to discover the magic of the world for themselves. And so, the legend of Rosie lived on, a shining example of the power of courage and the beauty of the world around us. And though she may be gone, her legacy would continue to inspire people for generations to come. Chapter 11: The End of the Adventure. The sun was setting over the mountains as the group of adventurers made their way back to the village. They had just completed a long and treacherous journey through the wilderness, encountering all sorts of dangers along the way. As they approached the village gates, they were greeted by a group of people who had come to welcome them home. The villagers cheered and applauded as they passed, thanking them for their bravery and celebrating their safe return. But as Rosie looked out over the cheering crowd, she realized that her own adventure was coming to an end. She had traveled the world, seen incredible sights, and made countless friends along the way. But now, it was time for her to retire and pass on the torch to the next generation. As she looked around at her friends and companions, Rosie knew that she had made the right choice. She had inspired them to be brave, to explore the world, and to always look for the magic in life. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the last of the cheers faded away, Rosie retired to her cottage on the edge of the village. She spent her days tending to her garden, reading books, and reflecting on her adventures. And though she was no longer traveling the world, she knew that her legacy would live on. Her friends and companions continued to embark on new adventures, passing down the lessons that Rosie had taught them to new generations of adventurers. And so, the adventure never truly came to an end. It continued on through the lives of those who had been inspired by Rosie, and through the magic and wonder of the world around them.